Sometimes fear makes us do things we never imagined possible. Sometimes a single moment of desperation can change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the life we've been living. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Montana, schoolteacher Eleanor Hartwell has been hiding a terrible secret behind her quiet smiles and proper manners. When she sees her husband crossing the street one afternoon, sheer panic takes over. Without thinking, she grabs the hand of the nearest stranger and pretends he belongs to her. But she's made a fatal mistake. The man whose hand she's clutching is Cade Mercer, the mountain man everyone in town fears and no one dares approach. Now the whole settlement is watching and waiting. What kind of marriage drives a woman to risk everything by taking the hand of the most dangerous man in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Eleanor Hartwell arranged the primers on her students' desks. Her fingers trembled slightly as she straightened each book, a habit she'd developed over the past 3 years, keeping her hands busy so no one would notice the shake. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and pine, familiar scents that usually brought her comfort. Today they only reminded her how small her world had become. She wore a high-necked dress in deep blue, properly buttoned to her throat despite the August heat. The porcelain cameo brooch at her collar had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions Thomas allowed her to keep from her life before. She touched it now, a nervous gesture, remembering the woman who'd pinned it to her own collar 20 years ago. Her mother had been strong, certain. Eleanor wondered what she'd think of the daughter who'd let herself become so diminished. Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory, had seemed like a promise when she'd arrived 5 years ago. A town built on hope and hard work, where families carved futures from stubborn earth and stubborner mountains. The settlement sprawled along the valley floor, 200 souls trying to make something lasting. There was the bank where Thomas worked, the general store run by the Hendersons, the saloon that respectable women didn't acknowledge, and her schoolhouse at the eastern edge of town where the buildings gave way to wilderness. She'd met Thomas Hartwell within a month of her arrival. He'd been charming then, attentive in ways that made her feel seen after years of invisibility back east. The town banker, educated and well-spoken, with prospects that seemed solid as the mountains surrounding them. He'd courted her with poetry and Sunday afternoon walks, speaking of partnership and building a life together. She'd believed every word. The wedding had been beautiful. Half the town attended, and Eleanor had worn white lace with orange blossoms in her hair. Thomas had smiled at her with such tenderness that she'd felt certain she was making the right choice. Perhaps she had been lonely too long. Perhaps she'd wanted to believe in the fairy tale too much to see the warning signs. The change had been gradual. First, it was suggestions about her clothing, perhaps something more modest, more befitting a banker's wife. Then comments about her friends. Were they really the sort of people she should associate with? The schoolteacher's salary she'd been so proud of became their money, deposited directly into an account only he could access. For household expenses, he'd said. To make things simpler, by the time she realized she was trapped, the cage had already locked. Eleanor moved to the window, watching the town come alive. Across the street, old Mr. Chen swept the boardwalk in front of his laundry. 2 doors down, the blacksmith's hammer rang against anvil, a steady rhythm that had marked her mornings for years. She knew every sound, every face, every routine. The familiarity that had once felt comforting now felt suffocating. Her gaze drifted to the mountains beyond town, those massive sentinels of stone and pine that ringed the valley. Somewhere up there, beyond the tree line where the peaks scraped clouds, Cade Mercer made his home. She'd never seen his cabin, of course. No one had. But everyone in Cedar Ridge knew of the mountain man, spoke his name in whispers edged with fear and fascination. The stories varied depending on who told them. Some said he'd been a marshal once, down in Texas or maybe Kansas, before something broke inside him and he'd retreated to the wilderness. Others claimed he'd killed a man with his bare hands over a card game, or a woman, or some slight no one could quite remember. Mrs. Henderson swore he was part Indian, though she'd never gotten close enough to say for certain. The children frightened each other with tales of the wild man who ate raw meat and could track a whisper through stone. Eleanor had seen him only a handful of times in the 4 years since he'd settled in the high country. He came to town perhaps once a month, always alone, moving through the streets like smoke, tall and lean, with dark hair worn longer than fashion dictated and eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. He never spoke unless necessary, conducted his business at the general store with quiet efficiency, and disappeared back into the mountains before sundown. People gave him wide berth. Even the roughest men from the saloon, the ones who'd pick fights over spilled whiskey or imagined insults, stepped aside when Cade Mercer walked past. There was something in the way he carried himself, a coiled stillness that suggested violence held in careful check. Eleanor had watched once as 3 cowboys fresh from the trail started to block his path, probably drunk and looking for entertainment. Cade had simply stopped and looked at them, hadn't said a word, hadn't raised a hand, just looked. They'd scattered like tumbleweeds in wind. She understood that fear now, the instinct to make yourself small in the presence of someone whose capacity for harm you couldn't measure. She lived with it every day. The school bell rang at 8 o'clock, and children began arriving in clusters. The youngest ones bounded up the steps with the enthusiasm of puppies, while the older students trudged with the resignation of those who'd rather be anywhere else. Eleanor greeted each by name, noting scraped knees and new growth spurts, missing teeth and hand-me-down dresses. Teaching was her sanctuary. For 6 hours each day, she could focus on conjugating verbs and working sums, on the light that dawned in a child's eyes when understanding finally clicked into place. These children didn't judge her or pity her, they simply needed her, and that need was the closest thing to purpose she had left. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," said Sarah Chen, Mr. Chen's granddaughter. The girl was 10, bright as a new penny, with a gift for reading that Eleanor nurtured carefully. "Good morning, Sarah. Did you finish the chapter I assigned?" The girl's face lit up. "I finished the whole book." Eleanor smiled, a real smile that felt strange on her face. "Of course. Remind me at lunch, and we'll find you something new." The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of lessons. Eleanor lost herself in teaching long division to the middle students while the youngest practiced their letters. She was explaining fractions when she noticed young Timothy Mason staring out the window, his attention caught by something in the street. "Timothy, are you with us?" The boy blinked, then pointed. "Miss Eleanor, isn't that Mr. Hartwell?" Her blood went cold. She turned to the window carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter something fragile. Thomas stood across the street near the bank, but he wasn't heading inside. He was looking toward the schoolhouse, his posture rigid with the particular tension she'd learned to read like weather signs. He'd been drinking, she could tell from here, from the way he held himself too carefully, the way his jaw set. Something had happened, a business deal gone wrong, perhaps, or some imagined slight he'd nursed into rage over his morning whiskey. It didn't matter what triggered it. What mattered was that he was angry and looking for her. Eleanor's hand went to her throat, fingers catching on the cameo brooch. The bruises on her ribs from last week's episode had finally faded to yellow. Her wrist had stopped aching, where he'd grabbed her 3 days ago when she'd served his dinner 30 seconds too slowly. She couldn't endure another lesson in obedience, not today, not in front of the children who trusted her to be strong. "Children," she said, her voice remarkably steady, "continue working on the problems I've written on the board. I'll return in just a moment." She walked to the door on legs that wanted to run, wanted to collapse, wanted to do anything except carry her toward the inevitable. But she'd learned that running only made it worse. Better to face it, accept it, endure it, better to protect the small spaces where she could still breathe. Eleanor stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. The late morning sun seemed too bright, the ordinary sounds of town too cheerful for what was coming. Thomas had started across the street toward her, his gait purposeful, despite the slight uncertainty that betrayed the alcohol. She couldn't let him reach the schoolhouse. Couldn't let the children see. Couldn't let that particular humiliation be added to all the others. Without thinking, without planning, Eleanor stepped off the schoolhouse porch and walked quickly toward Main Street. She needed to intercept him somewhere public, somewhere he'd have to maintain the facade of the respectable banker. Somewhere she might survive whatever was coming with her dignity marginally intact. She was so focused on Thomas, on calculating angles and escape routes from years of practice, that she didn't see the other man until she collided with him. The collision jarred Eleanor from her single-minded focus. She stumbled, would have fallen if not for the hand that steadied her large, calloused, surprisingly gentle. Her own hand shot out instinctively, grabbing fabric, an arm, anything to keep her upright. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing hard, her fingers wrapped around a stranger's wrist. Then she looked up. Cade Mercer stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that should have frightened her. Perhaps it would have, on any other day, but she'd already spent her allotment of fear on Thomas, and now there was only desperate calculation. Thomas was 20 yards away and closing. The mountain man was right here, solid as stone. Eleanor made a choice that would change everything. She shifted her grip, lacing her fingers through Cade's as if they belonged there. She stepped closer, into the space a wife might occupy beside her husband. She tilted her head slightly, affecting a casual intimacy she'd never felt with anyone. "There you are," she said, her voice pitched to carry. "I was just coming to find you." Cade's eyes narrowed fractionally. He didn't pull away, but she felt the tension in his arm, saw the slight shift in his stance. He was confused, possibly annoyed, but he hadn't rejected her yet. That was something. The street around them had gone quiet. Not the natural quiet of a peaceful morning, but the electric silence of a town holding its breath. Eleanor felt eyes on them from every direction, from the general store where Mrs. Henderson had frozen mid-sweep, from the saloon where even the early drinkers had emerged to watch, from the open doors and windows of a dozen businesses and homes. She'd just done the unthinkable. She'd touched the mountain man, claimed him, even in front of everyone. Thomas stopped in the middle of the street. Even in her peripheral vision, Eleanor could see the shock on his face, the way his mouth had fallen open in disbelief. The anger that had been building in his expression transformed into something more complex, confusion, humiliation, rage, all swirling together. "Eleanor." His voice carried across the dusty gap between them. "What in God's name are you doing?" She forced herself to meet his eyes, though every instinct screamed at her to lower her gaze, to apologize, to make herself small and harmless. Instead, she kept her hand firmly wrapped around Cade's and lifted her chin. "I'm speaking with my friend, Thomas. Is there something you needed?" The word friend was a lie so transparent it might have been laughable in any other context. Cade Mercer didn't have friends. Everyone knew that. And Eleanor didn't have permission to have friends, certainly not male friends, most definitely not this particular man. Thomas took a step forward, and Eleanor felt Cade shift beside her. The mountain man had remained perfectly still throughout this strange tableau, but now there was a subtle change in the way he stood. His weight redistributed almost imperceptibly. His free hand, which had been hanging loose at his side, moved slightly closer to his hip, where she could see the worn handle of a knife. "Step away from my wife, Mercer." Thomas's voice had taken on the authoritative tone he used at the bank, the one meant to remind people of his position. "I don't know what game she's playing, but doesn't look like a game to me." Cade's voice was quiet, rough from disuse, but it cut through Thomas's bluster like a blade through silk. "Looks like a woman who doesn't want to talk to you." The simple observation hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the wall she'd built around her fear. When was the last time anyone had acknowledged what she wanted? When had anyone stood between her and Thomas's will? Thomas's face flushed red. "You have no right to interfere between a man and his wife. Eleanor, come here, now." The command was familiar. She'd heard it 1,000 times, in 1,000 variations. Her body knew how to respond. The automatic compliance drilled into her through years of consequences. Her muscles tensed, preparing to obey. But Cade's hand tightened fractionally around hers. Not restraining, not controlling, just present. A choice she could make if she wanted to. "No," Eleanor heard herself say. The word felt foreign in her mouth, dangerous as dynamite. "I'm not ready to speak with you yet, Thomas. Perhaps later. Perhaps never." But she didn't say that part out loud. Thomas took another step forward, his hands curling into fists. The respectable banker mask was slipping now, revealing glimpses of the man she knew behind closed doors. "Eleanor, I will not be humiliated like this. You will come here immediately, or I promise you will regret." "That sounds like a threat." Cade's voice remained quiet, conversational almost, but something in his tone made Thomas stop mid-stride. "Can't help but notice you're making threats to a woman in front of half the town. That seem right to you?" A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Eleanor realized with a start that they had drawn quite an audience. It seemed everyone within earshot had found a reason to step outside, to pause their work, to witness this unprecedented confrontation. Sheriff Hawkins emerged from his office across the street, his weathered face creased with uncertainty. He was an old man, more politician than lawman, who'd held his position through the careful cultivation of influential relationships. Thomas, being chief among his influential friends. "Now, let's all just calm down here," Hawkins said, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps she should make her own choices," Cade interrupted. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't changed his relaxed posture, but somehow he commanded attention in a way the sheriff couldn't match. "Seems clear enough she doesn't want to go with him right now." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She was acutely aware of her hand still clasped in Cade's, of how this must look to everyone watching. She'd wanted to create a distraction, to avoid Thomas's immediate wrath. Instead, she'd created a scandal that would have the whole town talking for months. But she couldn't bring herself to let go. "This is absurd," Thomas sputtered. His careful control was crumbling, revealing the volatility underneath. "Eleanor has clearly lost her senses. She needs to come home immediately so you can what?" The question came from an unexpected source. Chen stood in front of his laundry, his usual stooped posture straightened for once. "We've all seen the bruises, Mr. Hartwell, heard the arguments through thin walls. Some things aren't as private as you might think." Eleanor's breath caught. Mr. Chen knew? Who else knew? How many people had watched her suffering in silence, saying nothing? Thomas's face went from red to white. "How dare you suggest my relationship with my wife is no concern of—" "It's everyone's concern when a man raises his hand to a woman." This from Mrs. Henderson, who had never shown Eleanor anything but cool propriety. "We may not have spoken up before, Mr. Hartwell, but that doesn't mean we haven't noticed." The crowd murmured agreement, and Eleanor felt the world tilting beneath her feet. All this time, she'd thought her shame was hidden, her failure as a wife kept carefully secret. But they'd known. They'd all known, and they'd let it happen anyway. Thomas seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. His eyes, bloodshot and furious, fixed on Cade with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Mercer. You think you can steal another man's wife, and didn't steal anyone." Cade's voice remained maddeningly calm. "She came to me. That ought to tell you something about the situation she's in." It was too much for Thomas. He lunged forward, hand reaching for Eleanor's arm with the violent intent she knew too well. But he never reached her. Cade moved with a speed that belied his stillness. One moment he was standing beside Eleanor, the next he was between them, his hand locked around Thomas's wrist in a grip that made the banker cry out. They stood frozen like that, Cade looking down at Thomas with an expression that promised terrible things without a single word spoken. "Don't," Cade said simply. Thomas tried to pull away, but Cade held him effortlessly for another long moment before releasing him with a slight push that sent Thomas stumbling backward. The banker caught himself, his face contorted with humiliation and rage. "This isn't finished," Thomas hissed. "You'll both pay for this. I'll see to it personally." He turned and stalked away, his dignity in tatters, followed by the eyes of everyone on the street. The crowd began to disperse slowly, whispering among themselves, casting glances at Eleanor and Cade that ranged from sympathetic to scandalized to something darker. Eleanor realized she was shaking. Her hand had gone numb where it still gripped Cade's, but she couldn't seem to release it. If she let go, she might collapse. If she let go, she might have to face what she'd just done. "You all right?" Cade asked, his voice lower now that the immediate crisis had passed. Eleanor looked up at him. This man, whose reputation had been built on violence and isolation, who just defended her in front of the entire town. His eyes held none of the pity she'd expected, only a quiet assessment that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm better than I would have been if you hadn't been here." Cade studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, decisive. "You can't go back to him. You know that." It wasn't a question. Eleanor found herself nodding anyway, the reality of her situation crystallizing with perfect, terrifying clarity. She'd just publicly defied her husband, claimed protection from the most feared man in the territory, and made herself the center of a scandal that would define her for years to come. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. Cade's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Yes, you do. Come on." He turned, still holding her hand, and began walking toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to wilderness. Eleanor followed, her legs moving automatically, her mind spinning with the implications of this moment. Behind them, Cedar Ridge buzzed with the news that would spread like wildfire through every home and business before sundown. The schoolteacher had left her respectable husband for the mountain man. The respectable banker's wife had run off with a killer. Eleanor Hartwell had lost her mind, her morals, or found her courage, depending on who was telling the story. Eleanor didn't look back. For the first time in 3 years, she walked forward into uncertainty with something that felt dangerously close to hope. 3 weeks passed on the mountain, and Eleanor discovered muscles she never knew existed. Her hands, once soft and carefully maintained, developed calluses from splitting wood and hauling water. Her skin darkened from hours spent outdoors, and her hair, freed from its tight constraints, lightened in the sun. She barely recognized herself in the small mirror Cade kept by the wash basin. But the changes went deeper than physical. She moved differently now, with less hesitation, less of that constant vigilance that had defined her life with Thomas. When Cade spoke to her, she no longer flinched at sudden sounds. When he moved near her, she didn't automatically shrink away. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine. Mornings were for practical work, maintaining the cabin, tending the small garden, gathering supplies. Afternoons, Cade continued her education in survival. He taught her to shoot, first with a small pistol, then with the rifle. Eleanor had never held a gun before, and the weight of it felt strange and powerful in her hands. "Squeeze. Don't pull," Cade instructed as she aimed at a target he'd set up against a fallen log. "Take your time. The shot will come when you're ready." Eleanor breathed as he'd taught her, let her body settle, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. She'd have another bruise there, but the can on the log flew backward, punctured cleanly. "Better," Cade said, something like pride in his voice. "You're a natural." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. She'd grown accustomed to his quiet presence, the way he explained things without condescension, corrected mistakes without making her feel stupid. He treated her like an equal, something Thomas had never done. But their peace couldn't last forever. One morning, a rider appeared at the tree line below the cabin. Eleanor saw him first, her stomach clenching with immediate fear. But Cade, watching from the porch, relaxed fractionally. "It's Henderson," he said, "from the general store. He's all right." Mr. Henderson dismounted slowly, approaching the cabin with the careful respect one might show a sleeping bear. He was a round man, balding, with kind eyes that had always slipped away from Eleanor's bruises in town. "Mr. Mercer," he called out. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope I'm not intruding." "Depends on what you came to say," Cade replied evenly. Henderson climbed the porch steps, hat in hand, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Just thought you should know what's happening in town. Things have gotten complicated." Eleanor's hands twisted in her apron. "Thomas? He's been busy, ma'am, using his position at the bank to make things difficult for anyone he thinks might be sympathetic to you." Henderson's expression was troubled. "He's called in loans early, raised interest rates on people without explanation. The Johnsons lost their farm last week because he wouldn't extend their note like he promised." Cade's jaw tightened. "He's punishing people for your choices." "It's worse than that," Henderson continued. "He's been working with Sheriff Hawkins. They're looking for legal grounds to force Mrs. Hartwell back, claiming she's not of sound mind, that she was coerced. And—" he paused, glancing at Eleanor with something like apology. "He's saying the marriage isn't over, that a wife can't simply leave her husband because she's unhappy." "I didn't leave because I was unhappy," Eleanor said quietly. "I left because he was killing me by inches." Henderson nodded. "Some of us know that, ma'am, more than you might think. But Mr. Hartwell, he's a persuasive man, and he controls a lot of money in that town, money that people depend on." "What else?" Cade asked. His voice had gone dangerously soft. Henderson pulled a folded paper from his coat. "He's had this drawn up. It's a deed transfer. Claims you've been squatting on bank land all these years, Mr. Mercer. Says the property your cabin sits on was part of a loan default from years back, and the bank holds title." Cade took the paper, his face darkening as he read. Eleanor watched him, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, the white-knuckle grip on the document. "This is false," he said finally. "I bought this land fair and square from old Jacob Winters 8 years ago. I've got the deed filed in the territorial office. Mr. Hartwell says those records were filed incorrectly, that the original owner didn't have clear title to sell." Henderson spread his hands helplessly. "I don't know the truth of it, Mr. Mercer, but he's planning to evict you within the month if you don't comply with his terms." "Which are?" Henderson looked at Eleanor. "That Mrs. Hartwell returns home, and this whole unfortunate incident is forgotten." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Thomas was using his power to back Cade into a corner, turning Eleanor's presence into a liability that could cost him everything he'd built here. "Tell Hartwell he can take his terms, and—" Cade started. "Wait," Eleanor interrupted. Both men turned to look at her. "Mr. Henderson, what would happen if I went back? Would Thomas leave everyone else alone?" "Eleanor, no," Cade said sharply. "I'm just asking." She kept her eyes on Henderson. "Would he?" Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "He's indicated as much, yes. If you return and things go back to normal, he'll forgive the various financial difficulties he's created. But Mrs. Hartwell, going back to him after all this, I can't imagine it would be safe for you." "It wouldn't," Eleanor agreed. "He'd make sure I never had the chance to leave again." She turned to Cade. "But I can't let other people suffer because of my choices. The Johnsons have children." "The Johnsons aren't your responsibility," Cade interrupted. "Your safety is. But their suffering is Thomas's doing, and he's only doing it because of me." "No," Cade's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "He's doing it because he's a vindictive bastard who can't stand being crossed. That's on him, not you." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but the guilt sat heavy in her stomach. How many people would Thomas hurt to get to her? How far would he go? Henderson cleared his throat. There's something else you should know. Some of us in town, we've been talking. Not everyone agrees with what Mr. Hartwell's doing. We've seen how he treats people who can't fight back, and we don't like it. If it comes to a confrontation, you won't be alone. That could be dangerous for you, Cade warned. Maybe, but some things are worth the risk. Henderson settled his hat back on his head. I should get back before I'm missed. Just wanted you to know where things stand. After Henderson left, Eleanor and Cade stood on the porch in heavy silence. The mountains stretched around them, beautiful and indifferent to human complications. I won't let him force you back, Cade said finally. I don't care what threats he makes. He'll destroy you, take your home, your land, everything. Land can be replaced. You can't. He turned to face her, his expression intense. Listen to me, Eleanor. I've lost plenty in my life. Property, position, peace of mind. I can lose more. What I can't do is stand by and watch him hurt you again. I won't. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, a warmth spreading through the fear. Why? Why does it matter so much to you? Cade was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. Because you remind me that there's still something worth protecting in this world. Because you grabbed my hand when you could have chosen anyone, and maybe that means something. Because... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I haven't cared about anyone in a long time, and I find that I care about what happens to you. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing his arm in the same gesture she'd used weeks ago when he'd shared his past. I care about what happens to you too, she said softly, which is why I can't let Thomas destroy everything you've built here. Then we'll find another way. Together. Cade covered her hand with his, and Eleanor felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. He wants to use the law and money against us. Fine. We'll find leverage of our own. What kind of leverage? A hard smile touched Cade's mouth, and for a moment Eleanor saw the marshal he'd been. Every man has secrets, Eleanor. Even respectable bankers. Maybe especially respectable bankers. We just need to find out what Thomas Hartwell doesn't want people to know. Eleanor thought of her husband, of the careful way he controlled every aspect of his life and hers. Of the locked study she'd never been permitted to enter, the business meetings he conducted behind closed doors, the papers he kept in a safe whose combination he'd never shared. I might know where to start looking, she said slowly. The days that followed took on a different quality. Where before Eleanor had been learning to survive, now she was learning to fight back. The shift was subtle but profound, changing how she moved through the world. Cade continued teaching her practical skills, but with new purpose. She practiced with the rifle until she could hit a target at 50 yards. He taught her to move quietly through the forest, to observe without being seen. Small lessons in becoming harder to hurt, harder to control. But Eleanor found her own kind of strength too, one that had nothing to do with weapons or wilderness. She started a journal, using paper and pencil Cade brought from his supplies. In it, she recorded everything she could remember about Thomas's business dealings, the conversations she'd overheard, the visitors who came late at night, the tension in his voice when certain names were mentioned. Patterns emerged that she'd never noticed before, threads of something not quite right. The journal became more than a record. She filled it with pressed flowers from the mountain meadows, sketches of the landscape, observations about the changing seasons. Each page was a reclamation of herself, proof that her thoughts and observations mattered. One afternoon, while Cade was checking his trap lines, Eleanor ventured farther from the cabin than she'd gone before. She found a meadow, carpeted with wildflowers, lupine and Indian paintbrush, columbine and mountain asters. The riot of color took her breath away. She sat among them, letting the sun warm her face, listening to the wind and the insects and the distant call of a hawk. This was peace, she realized. Not the forced calm of Thomas's house where any noise might trigger rage, but genuine peace. The kind that came from being exactly where you wanted to be, doing exactly what you chose to do. When she returned to the cabin, she found Sarah Chen sitting on the porch steps, a slate and chalk in her lap. "Sarah!" Eleanor hurried forward, delighted and concerned in equal measure. "What are you doing here? Does your grandfather know where you are?" The girl nodded, her face serious. "He sent me. Said I needed to continue my lessons, and if you weren't coming to town, I should come to you." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. Mr. Chen was risking Thomas's displeasure by allowing this. "That's very kind of him. And brave. Grandfather says that brave and kind should be the same thing." Sarah held up her slate. "I've been practicing my letters like you taught me. Will you check my work?" They spent the next hour on lessons, sitting in the dappled shade of the porch. When Cade returned, he found them conjugating verbs, Sarah's high voice mixing with Eleanor's patient corrections. He paused at the tree line, watching, and something soft crossed his usually guarded expression. Sarah wasn't the only visitor. Over the following days, other children made the climb: Timothy Mason with his younger sister, the Peterson twins, even surly John Garrett, who'd never shown much interest in schooling before. They came with their slates and readers, hungry for the education Eleanor provided. And they brought news. "Papa says Mr. Hartwell's been drinking more," Timothy reported during one lesson. "Heard him arguing with Sheriff Hawkins outside the saloon, something about papers and evidence. Mama told me the bank rejected their loan extension," added Mary Peterson. "But then Mr. Henderson from the store said he'd extend their credit, and now Mama can buy flour again." Piece by piece, Eleanor built a picture of Cedar Ridge divided, Thomas using his power to punish and control, while others quietly resisted, finding ways to support each other despite the consequences. One evening, after the children had gone home, Eleanor sat on the porch with Cade and shared what she'd learned. "The town's splitting," she said. "Thomas thinks he can force everyone into line with money and threats, but some people are choosing differently." "Dangerous choice," Cade observed. "Maybe, but it's their choice to make." Eleanor ran her fingers over the journal in her lap, over the pressed flowers and careful notes. "I think Thomas has been stealing from the bank. Not just mismanaging funds, actually stealing. Some of the things the children have mentioned, about families losing money they'd deposited, about accounts that don't match what people remember." Cade leaned forward, his interest sharpening. "You're sure?" "Not completely. But Thomas always needed everything perfect, completely controlled. That kind of obsession usually hides something, and he kept that study locked for a reason. If he's embezzling, there'll be records. Has to be. Bank examiners come through eventually, and he'd need to hide his tracks." Eleanor nodded slowly. "He kept a ledger. I saw it once, years ago, before he started locking the study. Leather-bound, with brass corners. He was very particular about it, never let it out of his sight during business hours. That's what we need." Cade's voice held grim satisfaction. "Proof of his theft. That kind of crime supersedes everything else, his reputation, his position, even his rights as a husband. If we can prove he's a criminal, the territorial marshal would have to intervene. But how do we get it? That ledger will be in his study or at the bank, and both places are impossible to access." They sat in silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The problem seemed insurmountable. Thomas held all the power, all the access, all the legal authority. They had nothing but suspicions and hope. Then Eleanor remembered something. "There's a third place he might keep records. Thomas has a safety deposit box at the bank. He thought I didn't know about it, but I saw him accessing it once. Box number 47. Cade turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "Banks aren't fortresses. They're just buildings with locks, and locks can be picked if you know what you're doing." "You know how to pick locks?" "Learned a lot of useful skills as a marshal, some of them not exactly legal, but effective." He paused. "But even if we get into the bank, into the box. We'd need to do it without being caught. Hartwell's probably watching the place like a hawk. Then we need a distraction, something big enough to draw attention away from the bank. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. The Harvest Festival. It's next week, isn't it? The whole town will be there, including Thomas. He'd never miss a chance to be seen as Cedar Ridge's leading citizen. Cade's eyes lit with understanding. While everyone's at the festival, the bank is empty. Not completely empty. There's always a guard. But maybe there's a way around that too. They talked late into the night, planning, adjusting, finding the holes in their scheme and patching them. It was dangerous, possibly foolish, and if they failed, the consequences would be severe. But sitting there in the lamplight, building a plan together, Eleanor felt more alive than she had in years. She was no longer just surviving, she was fighting back, and win or lose, that meant everything. The Harvest Festival dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that made promises of winter seem distant and impossible. From the cabin porch, Eleanor could see smoke rising from Cedar Ridge's cooking fires, could almost hear the distant sounds of celebration. Once, she would have been down there, standing beside Thomas with a fixed smile, playing the role of devoted wife while he worked the crowd. Today, she was preparing for something entirely different. Cade had gone down at first light, dressed in clothes that made him look almost civilized, clean trousers, a pressed shirt, his hair trimmed by Eleanor's careful hands the night before. He'd blend into the festival crowd, just another settler enjoying the celebrations. No one would connect him to the bank across the street. Eleanor waited, counting the minutes, her stomach tight with anxiety. So much could go wrong. The guard might not leave his post. Thomas might suspect something. The ledger might not be where she remembered. A dozen different disasters played through her mind. But they'd committed to the plan, and there was no turning back now. 2 hours after Cade left, Eleanor saw the signal smoke from a controlled fire on the eastern ridge, 2 distinct columns that meant the coast was clear. She grabbed the satchel they'd prepared and started down the mountain, taking the back trails Cade had shown her, the ones that approached town from an unexpected direction. She moved carefully, using the skills he'd taught her, staying in the shadows and moving during the festival's loudest moments when sound would cover any noise she made. It took an hour to reach the outskirts of Cedar Ridge and another 15 minutes to slip behind the buildings that fronted Main Street. The bank stood solid and imposing, its brick facade speaking of permanence and trust. Eleanor had passed it 1,000 times, never imagining she'd be breaking into it. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thomas had always accused her of being a criminal in spirit, and now she was proving him right. The back door was where Cade said it would be, and the lock was the type he'd taught her to recognize. She pulled out the tools he'd provided, her hands steadier than she'd expected. The lock fought her at first, but then something clicked and the door swung open. The bank's interior was dim, shadows pooling in corners, dust motes floating in the shafts of light from the high windows. Eleanor's heart hammered so loudly she was certain someone would hear it, but the building remained silent around her. Box 47 was in the center row, waist high, right where Thomas would want it, not too high to be inconvenient, not too low to suggest lack of importance. Eleanor used the master key Cade had somehow procured, and the small door swung open. Inside were papers, bundles of them, and the leather-bound ledger she remembered. She pulled everything out, spreading it on the floor, and began to read. What she found made her blood run cold. Thomas hadn't just been embezzling. He'd been running an elaborate scheme for years, one that involved Sheriff Hawkins, the territorial land office clerk, and several prominent businessmen. They'd been systematically defrauding settlers, falsifying land deeds, foreclosing on properties through manufactured debt, then reselling the same parcels to new victims. The amounts were staggering. Dozens of families had lost everything to Thomas's carefully orchestrated theft. But it was worse than that. As Eleanor read deeper into the documents, she found something that made her stomach turn. There were names listed with notations beside them. Handled, resolved, eliminated. Next to one named Jacob Winters, the man who'd sold Cade his land, someone had written in Thomas's distinctive hand, "Accident arranged. Claim filed." Jacob Winters hadn't died of natural causes. Thomas had had him killed so he could claim the land was never properly sold, that the bank held title through a defaulted loan that had never existed. Eleanor sat back, the papers scattered around her, understanding finally crystallizing. Thomas hadn't married her because he loved her. He'd married her because he needed the respectability, needed the facade of the upstanding family man to cover his crimes. She'd been a prop in his performance, nothing more. And Cade had been right to fear Thomas's legal maneuvering. The land claim wasn't just harassment, it was the beginning of another murder. Thomas would force Cade off the property one way or another, and if legal means didn't work, he had people who would make it look like an accident. Just like he'd done to Jacob Winters, and God knew how many others. Eleanor's hands shook as she began stuffing documents into her satchel. She needed to get these to someone in authority, someone beyond Thomas's influence. The territorial marshal maybe, or... A sound made her freeze. Footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside. She'd been so absorbed in her discovery that she'd lost track of time. Had the guard returned early? Had someone seen her enter? Eleanor scrambled to shove the remaining papers back into the box, her fingers clumsy with fear. She got the box closed and locked just as the front door rattled. Someone was trying the handle. She ran for the back door, clutching the satchel, her footsteps loud in the empty building. Behind her, she heard the front door open, heard a voice call out, "Who's there? This is bank property." Eleanor burst through the back door into the alley and ran. She didn't look back, didn't pause to see if she was being followed. She just ran, her skirts tangling around her legs, the satchel banging against her hip, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She made it to the tree line, crashed into the undergrowth, and kept going. Behind her, she heard shouts, but they grew fainter as she climbed. The forest swallowed her, and she used every trick Cade had taught her to cover her tracks, to become invisible. It took 2 hours to reach the cabin. Cade was already there, pacing the porch, his face tight with worry. When he saw her emerge from the trees, relief washed over his features. "Thank God," he said, catching her as she stumbled up the steps. "I heard shouting from town, thought maybe." "I got it," Eleanor gasped, holding up the satchel. "But Cade, it's worse than we thought, so much worse." They went inside, and Eleanor spread the documents across the table. As Cade read, his expression darkened, shifting from concern to rage to something harder and colder than Eleanor had ever seen. "He had Jacob killed," Cade said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "Old Jacob, who never hurt anyone, who sold me this land because he wanted to retire somewhere warm. Thomas had him murdered. There are others too. Look at this list." Eleanor pointed to the notations. "I think these are all people who got in his way, people who questioned transactions or threatened to expose him." Cade's hands curled into fists on the table. "How many?" "I counted at least 15 names with those notations. 15 people, Cade. And Thomas is still out there, still planning. Your name isn't on this list yet, but it will be." Cade straightened, his jaw set. He's not going to stop with legal harassment. He never planned to. The eviction notice, the property claim that was just to make it look legitimate when I turn up dead. Eleanor felt ice in her veins. "Then we have to act now. Take these documents to the territorial marshal, expose everything before Thomas realizes what we've taken and disappears," Cade finished, "or before he decides to accelerate his timeline and come after us directly. What do we do?" Cade studied the documents, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "We need to copy these. Hide the originals somewhere safe. Take copies to the marshal. But more than that, we need to make sure Thomas can't run, can't destroy evidence, can't hurt anyone else while we wait for the law to catch up." "How?" A grim smile touched Cade's mouth. "We force his hand, confront him publicly with what we know, make it so he can't make us disappear quietly. If the whole town knows what we've found, he can't kill us without exposing himself. That's incredibly dangerous. Everything about this situation is dangerous." Cade met her eyes. "But I'd rather face him head-on than wait for him to come at us from the shadows. At least this way, we control the timing." Eleanor thought of Thomas's face, his rage, his capacity for violence. Then she thought of Jacob Winters and the other names on that list, people who died because no one stood up to a respected banker with murder in his heart. "When?" she asked. "The harvest festival's still going. Everyone's there, including Thomas. We walk in, documents in hand, and we expose him in front of the whole town." Cade's expression was hard. "No more secrets, no more hiding. We end this today." Eleanor's heart raced, but she nodded. They'd come too far to turn back now. She'd stopped being a victim the moment she grabbed Cade's hand on that dusty street. Now it was time to stop being prey and become something Thomas had never expected, a woman willing to fight back. "Let me change into something more practical," she said. Cade nodded approval. "Wear the gun belt I gave you. And Eleanor, no matter what happens down there, you stay close to me. Understand?" "I understand." As Eleanor changed clothes, strapping on the small pistol Cade had taught her to shoot, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable from the one who'd fled Thomas's house weeks ago. Stronger, harder, more certain. She touched the cameo brooch at her throat. She'd kept wearing it, a reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled. Then she pinned it inside her shirt, close to her heart, and turned to face whatever came next. Thomas had built his empire on secrets and fear. Today, Eleanor and Cade were going to burn it all down. They descended the mountain as the afternoon sun slanted toward evening, the harvest festival's sounds growing louder with each step. Music drifted up from the valley, fiddles and guitars, laughter and shouted conversations. Under other circumstances, it might have been welcoming. Today it sounded like a gathering storm. Cade moved with purpose. The leather satchel containing copied documents slung across his shoulder. Eleanor walked beside him, feeling the weight of the pistol at her hip, the solid presence of ammunition in her pocket. She'd never imagined herself armed, walking into confrontation like this. But then, she'd never imagined a lot of things that had become her reality. As they reached the outskirts of town, Cade stopped, his hand on her arm. "Last chance to reconsider," he said quietly. "Once we start this, there's no taking it back. Thomas won't forgive it. The town won't forget it. Everything changes from here." Eleanor thought about the names in that ledger: Jacob Winters, Mary Thornton, James Chen, Sarah's uncle, whose death everyone had assumed was a riding accident. 15 people, maybe more. Their lives ended to protect one man's greed. "I'm done hiding," she said. "Done being afraid. If we don't stop him now, how many more names get added to that list?" Cade studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Stay close. Watch for the sheriff. He's dirty, but he's also a coward. If shooting starts, he'll look for cover before he looks for targets." "If shooting starts? Hartwell's got men. We knew that going in." Cade's expression was grim. "He can't afford to let us walk out of there with this information. He'll try to silence us one way or another." Eleanor's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to nod. "I understand." They walked into Cedar Ridge just as the festival reached its peak. Main Street had been transformed. Bunting and ribbons hung between buildings, tables groaned under the weight of food, and what seemed like the entire population had turned out in their finest clothes. Children ran between adults' legs, chasing each other in elaborate games. The scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. It would have been beautiful if Eleanor's heart wasn't hammering against her ribs. Thomas stood near the center of it all, holding court like a king among subjects. He dressed for the occasion: fine suit, polished boots, gold watch chain glinting in the sun. Eleanor recognized the watch immediately. He'd replaced the one she'd broken, of course, probably charged the cost to her imaginary debt. Sheriff Hawkins stood at Thomas's elbow, laughing at something the banker had said. Other men clustered around them, the land office clerk, several business owners, the sort of men who wielded power through money and connections rather than strength or principle. As Eleanor and Cade approached, conversations died like candles in wind. The silence spread outward in waves as people noticed them, turned to stare, whispered to neighbors. Within moments, the entire festival had gone quiet, all eyes on the mountain man and the runaway wife, walking side by side down Main Street. Thomas saw them. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, rage, calculation, and finally a cold smile that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "How unexpected. Have you finally come to your senses and returned home?" "I've come to expose a murderer," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her fear, "and a thief, and a fraud who's been destroying lives for years while hiding behind respectability." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Thomas's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Strong accusations from a woman who abandoned her marriage vows to live in sin with a wanted killer. He gestured at Cade. "Really, Eleanor, your moral authority is somewhat compromised." "I'm not wanted for anything," Cade said quietly. "But you are. Or you will be, once people see what's in this satchel." He opened the bag and pulled out the copied documents, holding them high enough for everyone to see. "These are bank records, proof that Thomas Hartwell has been systematically defrauding the people of Cedar Ridge for years, falsifying land deeds, foreclosing on imaginary debts, stealing deposits. Lies," Thomas cut in smoothly, "obviously forged by a desperate man trying to justify theft of another man's wife." "Then let's look at them together," Eleanor suggested. "Right here, right now, in front of everyone. Let the town judge whether they're forgeries or truth." She moved toward the nearest table, began spreading documents across its surface. People pressed closer, curiosity overcoming caution. Mrs. Henderson was first to lean in, her eyes scanning the papers, then widening. "This is my husband's signature," she said slowly, "on a loan agreement we never made, for property we don't own." "That's my father's name," someone else called out. "James Chen. This says he owed the bank $2,000, but he never borrowed anything. He owned his laundry free and clear." More voices joined in, people recognizing names and signatures, seeing their own transactions listed with amounts that didn't match their memories. The murmur grew louder, angrier, as understanding spread through the crowd. Thomas's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. Those documents were clearly stolen from private bank property. The crime here is burglary, not—" "Explain Jacob Winters," Cade interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "The man who sold me my land, the man whose death you marked as accident arranged in your personal ledger." The crowd went silent again, but this silence was different, heavier, more dangerous. "Jacob Winters died in a fall," Thomas said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "A tragic accident that was no accident." Cade pulled out another document, this one a letter in Thomas's handwriting. "You wrote instructions to someone named Garrett, told him exactly how to make it look natural, paid him $200 afterward." "Sam Garrett?" Mr. Henderson's face had gone white. He left town sudden-like, right after Jacob died, said he was going to California, but he never made it to California, Cade said grimly. "I'd bet money on that. Dead men don't spend their blood money, and dead witnesses don't testify." Eleanor watched Thomas, saw the calculation in his eyes as he weighed options. She saw the moment he decided that words wouldn't be enough, that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling and only violence could save it. "Sheriff," Thomas said sharply, Arrest these two for theft, trespassing and defamation. Use whatever force is necessary." Hawkins hesitated, his hand moving toward his gun, but not drawing it. He looked at the crowd, at the documents spread across the table, at the faces of people he'd known for years. "I'm not sure that's—" he began. "I said arrest them!" Thomas's composure shattered completely. "They've broken into the bank, stolen property, fabricated evidence against a respected member of this community. Do your duty, Sheriff, or I'll see you never work in law enforcement again." "Actually," a new voice cut in, "I think the sheriff might want to wait before following any orders from you, Hartwell." A man stepped out of the crowd, tall, weathered, with a silver star pinned to his vest. Eleanor didn't recognize him, but Cade's sudden stillness suggested he did. "Marshal Reed," Cade said quietly. "Mercer." The territorial marshal nodded to Cade with something that looked like respect. "Been a while. Heard you retired up here. Tried to. Didn't quite take." Reed moved to the table, began examining the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of evidence in his career. His expression grew darker with each page he turned. "How long have you been here?" Eleanor asked, confused. "Got into town this morning." Reed didn't look up from the papers. "Henderson sent word 3 weeks ago that something wasn't right with the bank. Said people's accounts were disappearing, families losing property under suspicious circumstances. Thought I'd come see for myself." Eleanor glanced at Mr. Henderson, who stood at the edge of the crowd, looking uncomfortable but determined. He'd been working against Thomas all along, quietly gathering evidence, calling for help. She felt a surge of gratitude. "Those documents are forgeries," Thomas insisted, but his voice had lost its power. "Any fool can see. Any fool can see handwriting," Reed interrupted. "And this handwriting matches samples I've got from official bank correspondence. Unless you're claiming someone forged your entire filing system?" He looked up, his eyes hard. "Thomas Hartwell, I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and on suspicion of murder in the deaths of Jacob Winters, James Chen, and approximately 13 other individuals listed in these records." "This is insane." Thomas backed away from the marshal, his eyes wild. "You can't possibly believe these lies. I'm a pillar of this community. I've done nothing but serve." He reached for something inside his coat. Cade moved faster, covering the distance between them in 2 strides, his hand clamping on Thomas's wrist before the banker could draw whatever weapon he'd concealed. "Don't," Cade said softly, dangerously. "Give me a reason, Hartwell, please." For a moment they stood frozen, Cade holding Thomas's wrist in an iron grip, Thomas's face contorted with rage and fear. Then Sheriff Hawkins finally found his spine, moving forward to help Marshal Reed secure the banker in chains. "You're both dead," Thomas hissed as they shackled him. "You hear me? I have people. I have money. I'll see you both buried before this is over." "Your people are here, Hartwell," Reed said, gesturing at the crowd. "And not one of them looks like they're on your side anymore." It was true. The faces around them showed shock, anger, betrayal, but no sympathy for the man who'd stolen from them, lied to them, murdered their neighbors. Thomas had built his power on fear and deception, but both had burned away in the harsh light of truth. As they led Thomas away, still shouting threats and protests, Eleanor felt Cade's hand find hers. She gripped it tightly, feeling the tremor in her own fingers, the adrenaline crash beginning to set in. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "Not quite," Cade replied. "There'll be a trial, testimony, legal proceedings. Could take months, and some of his hired men might still be around, might try to make good on his threats. But the worst of it?" Cade looked down at her, his dark eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "Yeah, the worst of it's over. You're free, Eleanor. Really free." The word settled over her like a benediction. Free. After years of captivity masked as marriage, after weeks of hiding and fear, after today's desperate gamble, she was finally, truly free. Around them, the festival slowly came back to life. People talked in urgent, excited voices, processing what they'd witnessed. Some approached Eleanor and Cade with thanks, others with apologies for not seeing the truth sooner. The Hendersons brought water and food, insisting they sit and rest. But Eleanor couldn't quite believe it yet. Couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas would find some way to reach her, even from a jail cell, that his threats would manifest in violence she couldn't predict or prevent. Cade seemed to sense her lingering fear. He squeezed her hand gently. "We'll stay vigilant, watch for trouble. But Eleanor, look around you." She did. Saw neighbors defending them to doubters. Saw children running and playing again, the tension broken. Saw Mr. Chen approaching with tears in his eyes, Sarah holding his hand, both of them looking at Eleanor like she'd given them something precious. "You gave us justice for James," Mr. Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. "We never knew, never understood what really happened to him. Thank you." Eleanor's own eyes filled with tears. "I wish we could have stopped it sooner. You stopped it now. That's what matters." He pressed something into her hand, a small jade pendant on a silk cord. "This was James's. He would want you to have it. For courage." After Mr. Chen and Sarah moved away, Eleanor examined the pendant. It was simple, beautiful, warm from the old man's hand. She fastened it around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart next to her mother's cameo. 2 talismans now, 2 reminders of why she'd fought, who she'd fought for. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The harvest festival had transformed into something else, a celebration of truth, of justice delayed but finally served. But Eleanor knew the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow there would be questions, legal proceedings, the slow machinery of justice grinding forward. There would be challenges and setbacks, people who still doubted, and the ever-present danger that Thomas's threats might become reality. But tonight, standing in the middle of Cedar Ridge, with Cade's steady presence beside her, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Victory. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas lay in the dusty street, his gun falling from nerveless fingers, his eyes staring sightlessly at the darkening sky. Eleanor stood frozen, the derringer still raised, smoke curling from its barrel. She'd shot a man. Killed him. Probably, though whether it was her bullet or Cade's that had done it, she couldn't say. Both shots had been on target, both fired in the same heartbeat of desperate defense. Cade's hand covered hers gently, lowering the gun. "It's all right," he said quietly. "It's over now. Really over." Marshal Reed moved forward cautiously, checking Thomas's pulse, then shaking his head. Behind them, the last Morrison brother threw down his weapon, hands raised in surrender. Other men emerged from hiding to secure him, their faces grim but determined. Eleanor couldn't stop staring at Thomas's body. 3 years of fear, of walking on eggshells, of carefully managed terror, ended in a single moment of violence. She should feel something, shouldn't she? Relief, or grief, or guilt. Something. Instead, she felt numb. "Mrs. Hartwell?" Marshal Reed approached carefully, his badge catching the torchlight. "I need to ask you some questions about what happened here." Eleanor found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. "He was going to shoot Cade. I couldn't let him." "I saw it," Mr. Henderson said, stepping forward. Others nodded agreement. Mrs. Chen, the Peterson family, 6 witnesses who'd seen Thomas raise his gun, seen the murder in his eyes. "Self-defense," Reed said definitively. "Both your shots. Man escaped custody, killed the sheriff, attempted to murder 2 witnesses to his crimes. About as clear-cut as it gets." He paused, his expression softening. "I know it doesn't feel that way right now. Taking a life never does, even when it's justified. But you saved lives tonight. Your own, Mercer's, probably others, if Hartwell had gotten his way." Eleanor nodded numbly. Cade's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm, anchoring her to the present moment. The town doctor arrived, confirming what everyone already knew. Thomas Hartwell was dead, so was Sheriff Hawkins. The Morrison brother Eleanor had wounded, would survive to stand trial alongside his sibling and their accomplice. As the bodies were covered and carried away, as order slowly returned to the shattered festival, Eleanor felt the enormity of what had happened settling over her. She'd killed her husband. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the justification, that truth would be part of her forever. "Come on," Cade said gently. "Let's get you somewhere quiet." He led her to the church, away from the crowd and the chaos. Inside, the sanctuary was dim and peaceful, lamplight flickering on the simple wooden pews. They sat together in the back row, and Eleanor finally let herself break. The tears came hard and fast, years of suppressed emotion pouring out. She cried for the woman she'd been when she arrived in Cedar Ridge, full of hope and dreams. She cried for the marriage that had been a lie from the start. She cried for Jacob Winters and James Chen and all the others whose names were in that ledger, whose lives had been stolen by a man she'd once promised to honor. And she cried for Thomas himself, for whatever had twisted him into the monster he'd become, for the waste of a life spent pursuing power through cruelty. Cade held her through it all, saying nothing, just being present in the way he'd learned to be solid, patient, accepting whatever she needed to feel. When the tears finally subsided, Eleanor felt hollowed out, but somehow cleaner, lighter. "I should feel guilty," she said quietly. "Shouldn't I? He was my husband, and He stopped being your husband the first time he raised his hand to you," Cade interrupted firmly. "What he was, toward the end, was a threat. A dangerous man who'd killed before and would have killed again. You stopped him. That's nothing to feel guilty about. But I should feel something other than relief. Relief is enough." Cade's hand found hers, his calloused fingers lacing through her smaller ones. "You survived, Eleanor. Against all odds, despite everything he did to break you, you survived. You're allowed to be glad about that." The church door opened, and Marshal Reed entered, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He approached with the respectful caution of a man who knew he was intruding on a private moment. "I wanted you to know," he said. "We found instructions in Hartwell's cell. He'd hidden them in his boot. They were orders to his men: kill you both, make it look like an accident if possible, and destroy the evidence. Tonight was always going to happen. You just made sure it ended differently than he planned." Eleanor absorbed this information, feeling validation for the shot she'd taken. It hadn't been murder. It had been survival. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Reed smiled slightly. "Now there's a lot of legal work to sort through. Hartwell's estate, the bank's assets, restitution to his victims. You're his widow, so legally you'll have a say in how some of that's handled, but that's all down the road. Tonight, you should rest. You've earned it." After Reed left, Eleanor and Cade sat in the quiet church for a while longer. Through the windows, they could see townspeople beginning to clean up from the festival, from the violence, putting their world back in order. "Will you come back to the cabin with me?" Cade asked. "Or do you need to be alone?" Eleanor thought about the mountain cabin, about the peace she'd found there, about the man who'd given her sanctuary when she'd had nowhere else to go. "Together," she said. "I want to go together." Cade smiled then, genuine and warm, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. The fear that had defined so much of her life was gone, burned away in gunfire and truth. What remained was possibility. They stood, hands still clasped, and walked out of the church into the night. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The mountain loomed dark against the sky, calling them home. Tomorrow would bring questions, complications, the slow work of healing and justice. But tonight, Eleanor was free. Truly, finally free. And that was enough. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the cabin porch, watching the first flowers of spring push through the lingering snow. The valley below showed patches of green among the white, promise of the season turning. She'd learned to read these signs now, to see in the landscape what was coming before it arrived. The winter had been long but not lonely. She'd spent it in the cabin, working through the legal complications of Thomas's death and the restitution process. Marshall Reed had been as good as his word. The bank's assets were frozen, examined, and gradually returned to those Thomas had defrauded. The Johnsons got their farm back. The Petersons received compensation for years of inflated interest. James Chen's family was given the laundry outright, deed free and clear. Eleanor had kept nothing from Thomas's estate except her mother's cameo and the books from her teaching days. Everything else went to his victims, as it should have. The town had slowly come to terms with what had happened. Some people still whispered, still looked at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and scandal, but others, more than she'd expected, had offered support. Mrs. Henderson brought fabric for new dresses. Mr. Chen sent tea and herbs. The children she'd taught kept visiting, hauling their slates up the mountain, refusing to let her forget that she was a teacher first and a scandal second. Sarah Chen came most often, her bright mind hungry for knowledge. Eleanor had started teaching her Latin and advanced mathematics, preparing her for the education she deserved. The girl had dreams of becoming a doctor, and Eleanor was determined to help her achieve them. Cade emerged from the cabin, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He'd changed too over these months. The wary isolation had softened into something more open. He'd even started coming to town occasionally, helping with repairs and heavy work, slowly becoming part of the community rather than its boogeyman. Thinking about something serious, he observed, handing her a cup, thinking about how much has changed. Eleanor accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing in a way that still sent warmth through her. 6 months ago I was terrified, trapped, convinced I'd never escape. And now? Now I'm free, teaching again, not in a schoolhouse but from a mountain cabin, making my own choices, sleeping through the night without fear. She turned to look at him. Happy. I'm actually happy, Cade. He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. Good. You deserve to be. They'd been dancing around their feelings all winter, moments of almost intimacy, followed by careful retreat, both of them aware of how quickly Eleanor's life had changed and wanting to be certain of what was real. But spring was coming, and with it, the sense that perhaps it was time to stop being cautious. Marshall Reed sent word, Cade said after a moment. The Morrison brothers were sentenced yesterday, 20 years in territorial prison. Their accomplice got 15. And the land office clerk? 10 years. He cooperated with the investigation, told them about other schemes in other towns, probably saved some folks from Hartwell's methods spreading elsewhere. Eleanor nodded, taking satisfaction in the justice served. It wouldn't bring back the dead, wouldn't undo the suffering, but it was something. An acknowledgement that actions had consequences, that power didn't exempt someone from accountability. A rider appeared on the trail below Mr. Henderson on his sturdy mare, a bundle strapped behind his saddle. He'd taken to making deliveries to the cabin, bringing supplies and news, serving as their connection to town. "Morning," he called as he dismounted. "Got mail for you both, and Mrs. Henderson sent bread and preserves." The mail included a letter from the Territorial Education Board. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers, read the contents, and felt tears prick her eyes. "They're reopening the schoolhouse," she said, "and they're asking if I'll come back as teacher. Full salary, complete authority over curriculum, no interference from the town council." She looked up at Cade. "They're giving me my job back." "That's good news," Cade said carefully. "If you want it." Did she want it? Eleanor thought about the schoolhouse, the structure and certainty of it. Then she thought about teaching Sarah on the cabin porch, about the freedom to shape young minds without committees and oversight, about the life she'd built here on this mountain. "I want to think about it," she said finally. "I'm not sure I'm ready to go back to town permanently." Henderson nodded, understanding. "Take your time. They're not filling the position until you decide." He paused, then pulled something else from his coat, a small leather-bound book. "Found this while cleaning out the old bank office. Thought you might want it." It was a journal, Eleanor's journal from before her marriage. She'd forgotten Thomas had taken it, had locked it away in his study, along with everything else that made her herself. Now it was back in her hands, pages filled with her younger self's hopes and dreams and observations about the world. After Henderson left, Eleanor sat with the journal in her lap, paging through entries from another lifetime. Some of what she read made her smile, some made her sad. All of it reminded her of who she'd been before fear had made her small. "I don't want to be her again," she said softly. "That woman who wrote these entries. But I don't want to forget her either." Cade sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You don't have to be either person completely. You get to choose who you are now." Eleanor closed the journal and looked at the man beside her, the one who'd protected her, taught her, stood with her through violence and aftermath, the one who'd given her space to heal and time to find herself again. "I want to stay here," she said, "on this mountain, in this cabin. I want to teach the children who come looking for lessons, and I want to keep learning the things you're teaching me. I want to build something new, something that's ours." "Ours," Cade repeated, testing the word. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He pulled something from his pocket, two simple bands of silver, clearly handmade, slightly imperfect and beautiful because of it. "I've been working on these all winter. Wasn't sure if you'd want them, after everything marriage meant to you before. But I wanted you to know the offer was there." Eleanor took one of the bands, feeling its weight, the care that had gone into its making. This wasn't like the ornate gold band Thomas had given her, the one that had felt like a shackle. This was simple, honest, offered rather than demanded. "Ask me," she said. Cade took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "Eleanor Hartwell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you have to, not because you're afraid or trapped, but because you choose it. Choose me. Choose us." "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, I choose this. I choose you. I choose us." He slipped the ring on her finger, and she did the same for him. No witnesses except the mountains, no ceremony except the promises they made to each other in quiet voices. But it felt more real, more binding than anything that had come before. They stood there on the porch as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of winter's snow. Below, Cedar Ridge went about its business, healing, rebuilding, moving forward. And above, on the mountain everyone had once feared, two people who'd found each other in desperation discovered something better in peace. Eleanor had grabbed a stranger's hand to hide from her husband, never knowing he was the mountain man everyone feared. But fear, she'd learned, was just a story people told themselves. The truth was more complicated, more human, and infinitely more hopeful. She'd been seeking safety and found freedom instead. She'd been running from one man and run toward another, and in the process, she'd discovered that sometimes the most terrifying choice was also the one that saved you. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying the scent of spring and possibility. Eleanor squeezed Cade's hand, feeling the solid reality of him beside her, and smiled at the future they'd build together. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of courage leading to the next, until fear was just a memory and freedom was as natural as breathing. This was her story now. Not the one Thomas had written, not the one the town whispered, but the one she was choosing for herself. And it was just beginning.